The message came on a quiet Tuesday morning, and it changed everything. Every radio, every television, every communication device on Earth suddenly carried the same signal. Ambassador Linda Morrison stood in the United Nations emergency chamber, her heart beating fast as the holographic projection flickered to life before her eyes. 12 alien species had sent their representatives. They sat in a perfect half-circle aboard the massive flagship of the Galactic Council. Their faces, if they could be called faces, showed no warmth, no welcome. Only cold judgment aimed at the small blue planet called Earth. High Chancellor Voreth spoke first. He was tall, taller than any human, with gray skin that looked like stone and 4 eyes that never blinked. His voice came through a translator device, flat and mechanical, stripped of all emotion. He told Linda that the Krellin Dominion had filed a formal complaint against humanity. Earth had broken 17 rules of something called the Galactic Compact. Linda listened carefully as the list of crimes grew longer. Human miners had set up operations on a distant world called Kepler-4 for to be. Human ships had entered space that belonged to the Council. Human traders had sold goods at prices that undercut merchants who had been doing business for thousands of years. Each accusation carried the same hidden message: humanity was growing too fast, reaching too far, and the old powers of the galaxy did not like it. When Vorath finished reading the charges, offered what he called a gift of mercy. Humanity would leave every territory they had claimed in the past 50 years. Human ships would allow Council soldiers to search them whenever they wanted. Human scientists would share all their discoveries with the Council. Who would decide which technologies were safe and which were too dangerous for such a young species to possess? Linda asked for time to discuss these terms with her government. Voreth's 4 eyes narrowed slightly, but he agreed. 72 hours? 3 days to decide the fate of the human race. Back on Earth, the emergency meetings began immediately. President Daniel Hughes sat at the head of a long table in a secure room. Deep beneath the White House, his coffee went cold as generals argued with diplomats and scientists. The military leaders wanted to fight. The diplomats wanted to talk. The scientists showed charts and graphs that all said the same thing. The Council had more ships, bigger weapons, and thousands of years more experience than humanity. By any reasonable measure, Earth could not win. The arguments went round and round for 49 hours. People shouted. Some pounded the table. Others sat in silence, their faces gray with fear. It seemed like no one could agree on anything. Then Admiral Catherine Price stood up. She was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that had seen battles across 3 star systems. She walked to the main screen and pulled up a map of the galaxy. With one finger, she traced the path of humanity's expansion over the past 300 years. Look at this, she said. In 3 centuries, humans had spread to 47 star systems. They had built factories on asteroids. They had made dead moons green and alive. They had created trade routes that stretched across distances most Earthbound humans could not even imagine. All of this while the Council species sat comfortable in their ancient empires, doing things the same way they had done them for 6,000 years. The Krellin Dominion was not angry because humanity had broken rules, Catherine explained. They were angry because humanity had stopped asking for permission. For the first time in thousands of years, someone had looked at the galaxy and said, "We will take what we can reach, and we will not apologize for reaching." The room fell silent. President Hughes stared at the star map for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. He had made his decision. On the 3rd day, Ambassador Linda Morrison returned to the Council chamber. She stood alone before the 12 alien representatives, single human woman facing powers that could crush her planet without effort. But her voice did not shake when she delivered Earth's answer. Humanity respectfully declined the Council's terms. The territories would remain under human control. Human ships would not submit to searches. Human technology belonged to humanity, and humanity alone would decide how to use it. Earth had not signed the Galactic Compact, and Earth did not accept rules made by others without Earth's voice in the conversation. For a moment, the chamber was completely silent. High Chancellor Vorath leaned forward, all four of his eyes fixed on Linda's face. He had expected bargaining. He had expected fear. He had expected the humans to beg for slightly better terms, as every other young species had done when faced with the Council's power. Instead, he received something the Galactic Council had not encountered in 6,000 years of ruling the stars. He received a simple, clear, absolute refusal on Earth. People watched the broadcast on screens in their homes, in bars, in public squares. They saw their ambassadors stand firm before creatures that could destroy everything humanity had built. Some people cheered. Others felt their stomachs twist with fear. Everyone understood that something had changed, something that could never be unchanged. In a small apartment in Chicago, a young woman named Rebecca Cole watched with her elderly grandmother. The old woman had been born before humanity even reached Mars, back when the stars were just lights in the night sky. Now she watched her granddaughter's generation challenge the rulers of the galaxy. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. Her grandmother took her hand and squeezed it tight. "Now," she said, "we find out what we are made of." Across the planet, similar conversations took place. Parents tried to explain to children what the news meant. Workers stopped their jobs to gather around screens. Soldiers checked their weapons and looked up at the sky, wondering what was coming. In the council chamber, High Chancellor Vorath finally spoke. His voice carried a new edge, something that might have been anger, or might have been respect. He told Ambassador Morrison that humanity had chosen a difficult path. The council had given them a chance to join the galactic community peacefully. They had refused. Now they would learn what happened to species that defied the established order. Linda. Morrison met his four-eyed gaze without flinching. She told him that humanity had been learning difficult lessons since they first climbed down from the trees. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars among themselves. They had reached for the stars when wise voices told them it was impossible. Whatever the council sent their way, humanity would face it the same way. They had faced every challenge in their history, together and without surrender. The transmission ended. The hologram faded. Linda Morrison stood alone in the empty chamber, her hands trembling slightly now that no one could see. She did not know what the future held. She only knew that humanity had made its choice. There was no going back. Outside the United Nations building, the sun was setting over New York City. The sky turned orange and pink and purple, beautiful colors that humans had been watching since the beginning of their existence. Somewhere out there, beyond that sunset, alien fleets were preparing to teach Earth a lesson in obedience. But as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, something else was happening too. All across the planet, people were looking up at those distant lights with new eyes. Not with fear, though fear was certainly there, but with something else, something harder to name: determination, defiance. The stubborn human refusal to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. The galaxy had given humanity an ultimatum, and humanity had given its answer. Now, the real struggle would begin. The Council's response came faster than anyone expected. Within 6 hours of Ambassador Morrison's refusal, 300 alien warships appeared at the edge of human space. They formed a wall of metal and weapons that stretched across the blackness. Blocking every major route between Earth and its colonies, Admiral Sithos commanded the fleet. He was Krellin, like the High Chancellor, with the same gray-stone skin and unblinking eyes. He broadcast his message on every frequency humanity used. No human ship would pass through the blockade. No supplies would reach the colony worlds. This would continue until Earth changed its mind and accepted the Council's generous terms. The blockade cut off 17 human colonies from the rest of civilization. These were not military bases, but homes. Families lived on those distant worlds. Children went to school there. Farmers grew crops in alien soil. Now they were trapped, their supply lines severed by an enemy they had never met. On Earth, the news created panic. Television screens showed crowds gathering outside government buildings. Some people demanded that the military attack immediately. Others carried signs begging for peace at any price. The streets filled with anger and fear in equal measure. Deep in the Pentagon, Admiral Catherine Price gathered her most trusted officers. Commander Gregory Cole, a tall man with a scarred face from the Mars uprising, spread tactical information across the main display screen. The numbers were not encouraging. The Council fleet had 12 times the firepower of every human warship combined. Their shields could survive nuclear weapons. Their guns could crack planets open like eggs, by every normal measure. Fighting back was madness. But Gregory had spent weeks studying the enemy, and he had noticed something interesting. The Council ships moved in perfect patterns, following formations that had not changed in thousands of years. They communicated on the same frequencies, at the same times. They rotated their crews according to schedules, could predict down to the minute. The Council had better technology and more ships. What they did not have was creativity. They had been doing things the same way for so long that they had forgotten how to adapt. Admiral Price proved the plan within the hour. 12 small stealth frigates slipped away from Earth, their engines running cold to avoid detection. Each ship was commanded by an officer chosen for one specific quality: the ability to think in ways the enemy would never expect. The frigates did not attack the warships. That would have been suicide. Instead, they went after the supply convoys that trailed behind the main fleet. The Council needed food, fuel, and spare parts, just like any military force. Those supplies traveled in slow, poorly defended transports that no one had thought to protect. The first raid happened at 3 a.m, Earth time. A frigate commanded by Captain Samuel Drake dropped out of stealth behind a Krellan supply ship. His crew disabled the transport's engines with precise shots that caused no casualties. They left a message in the Krellan language: "This ship is now property of humanity. Come and take it if you can." By the time Admiral Sithos learned what was happening, 4 more supply ships had been captured or disabled. His perfect formation broke apart as warships scrambled to protect their vulnerable support vessels. Gaps opened in the blockade, and human freighter captains were ready to exploit them. The first supply run was made by a cargo ship called the Northern Star. Its captain was a woman named Dorothy Bennett, 63 years old with gray hair and steady hands. She had been hauling freight between planets since before the blockade began. Now she navigated through the chaos of the broken formation. Her ship's computers turned off to avoid detection. Flying by instinct and dead reckoning alone, Dorothy reached the colony world of New Portland just before dawn, local time. The colonists had been rationing food for 2 weeks. When her ship landed with holds full of supplies, people wept with relief. Children who had gone to bed hungry ate their first real meal in days. Word spread quickly. Other captains followed Dorothy's example, finding their own paths through the shifting gaps in the blockade. Some were caught. Some were turned back. But enough got through to keep the colonies alive, one desperate run at a time. The Council demanded another meeting. High Chancellor Varath appeared on screens across Earth. His composure cracked for the first time since contact began. He called humanity's actions reckless. He called them dangerous. He warned of consequences that would echo for generations. President Hughes responded with a calm statement. Humanity had not fired weapons at any Council vessel. No alien soldier had been killed. If the blockade continued, Earth would continue to ensure its people received the supplies they needed. The methods might become less gentle if the situation dragged on. On New Portland, a farmer named Sandra Ellis watched the president's broadcast from her family's hydroponic greenhouse. The blockade had nearly destroyed them. Without equipment shipments, they could not expand their growing operations. Without medicine, her youngest son had suffered through a fever that should have been easily treated. Now, thanks to captains willing to risk everything, her seedlings were growing again. Her son was healthy. Her family had hope. Her daughter asked if there would be a war. Sandra did not know how to answer. She only knew that somewhere out there, in the cold darkness between stars, ordinary people were fighting for her right to grow vegetables on an alien world. That meant something. That had to mean something. The blockade continued for 3 months. Admiral Sithos tried every tactic in the Council's ancient military manuals. He tightened formations and loosened them. He sent hunting parties after the stealth frigates. He threatened dire punishment for any colony that accepted smuggled supplies. Nothing worked. Every time he closed one gap, humans found another. Every time he anticipated their movements, they did something unexpected. His crews grew tired and frustrated. Reports from home spoke of growing criticism. Questions about why such a powerful fleet could not control a handful of primitive smugglers? The turning point came on a Tuesday night, 3 months after the blockade began. A council patrol ship caught the Northern Star trying to slip through a narrow gap between two asteroids. Captain Dorothy Bennett was trapped, her old freighter no match for the warship's weapons. The council commander ordered her to surrender. Dorothy's response was broadcast across the entire sector. She told him that she was carrying medicine for children on New Portland. Those children were sick, and they needed this medicine to live. She was going to deliver it. He could shoot her down if he wanted, but he would have to explain to his superiors why he destroyed a medical shipment meant for sick children. The patrol ship held its position. Dorothy held hers. For 17 minutes, neither moved. Then slowly the council vessel pulled aside. The path to New Portland was open. Dorothy made her delivery. The children received their medicine, and across the galaxy, beings who had been taught that the council's word was law watched a single human freighter. Captain proved that it was not. Something had shifted. Not just in the balance of power, but in the way people thought about what was possible. If one old woman in a beat-up cargo ship could face down the mightiest military force in known space, what else might be possible? On Earth, Admiral Price received reports of the incident with a small smile. The blockade was not broken, not yet. But cracks were spreading through the Council's confidence, and humanity was learning what it could do, and it refused to accept limits set by others. The stars no longer seemed quite so cold or quite so distant. They were places where humans lived and worked and dreamed. Places worth fighting for, and humanity was just getting started. The message arrived through secret channels that Ambassador Linda Morrison did not know existed. Counselor Yanara of the Velith Sovereignty wanted to meet, alone on neutral ground. The invitation came with a promise. What she had to say could change everything. The Velith were ancient, older than most species in the galaxy. They had helped found the Council 6,000 years ago. In all that time, they had never publicly disagreed with a Council decision. They were known for their silence, their caution, and their careful neutrality in all disputes. Now, one of their highest representatives wanted to speak privately with humanity's ambassador. Linda did not know what to expect, but she knew she could not refuse. The meeting took place on a small station, orbiting a dead world between human and council space. Linda arrived without guards, as requested. The station was cold and empty, its corridors lit by flickering lights that had not been maintained in decades. Counselor Yanara waited in a room with a single table and 2 chairs. She was tall and thin, with silver skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Her eyes were large and luminous, reflecting colors that human eyes could barely process. When she spoke, her translator gave her words a musical quality, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. She had studied humanity, Janara explained, not just military reports and diplomatic files. She had examined human history, human art, human stories. She had read ancient myths about heroes who fought against impossible odds. She had watched recordings of humans celebrating victories that should never have happened. She had listened to human music, strange compositions that swung between sadness and defiance without warning. The Council had made a terrible mistake, she said. They had assumed humanity would behave like every other species that had learned to travel between stars. Careful, patient, willing to wait thousands of years for opportunities that might never arrive. But humanity was different. When humans looked at the galaxy, they did not see obstacles. They saw challenges. Every barrier became a problem to solve. Every rule became a limit to test. Every time someone told them no, they heard maybe. And every maybe became a yes, given enough time and effort. Linda listened carefully, not sure where this was leading. Yanara continued. The Velith had observed thousands of species rise and fall over the millennia. Most followed predictable patterns. They expanded, they stabilized, they declined. The galaxy absorbed them into its ancient rhythms. And eventually they became indistinguishable from all the others. Humanity would not follow this pattern. Yanara was certain of it. Something in the human spirit refused to accept limits, refused to settle for comfort when adventure was possible, refused to bow when standing was an option. This made humanity dangerous, yes. But it also made them the most important species the galaxy had seen in thousands of years. Yanara made her offer. The Velith's sovereignty would abstain from any vote against humanity. More than that, she would share intelligence about council discussions, military plans, and the growing tensions between member species. She would tell Linda, who was secretly sympathetic to humanity and who was determined to see them destroyed. In return, when humanity reshaped the galaxy, and she was certain they would, she wanted the Velith remembered as the first to recognize what was coming, the first to stand aside and let the future arrive. Linda transmitted Janira's offer to Earth that night. She expected Presid Hughes to debate the decision for days. Instead, the answer came within hours. The Velith had extended a hand across the stars. Humanity would not leave it empty. The intelligence Yanara provided proved more valuable than anyone anticipated. 3 council species were quietly questioning whether the conflict with humanity served any useful purpose. Their representatives made polite speeches supporting the blockade while secretly wishing it would end. The Krellin Dominion itself was not as unified as it appeared. Younger generations were challenging traditions their elders considered sacred. They asked uncomfortable questions about why the Dominion had the right to decide what other species could do. They wondered if the old ways still made sense in a changing universe. Most importantly, Inara revealed what the Council truly feared. It was not human ships or human weapons. It was human ideas. The concept that ordinary people could question their rulers. The belief that progress did not require permission from ancient authorities. The strange human conviction that the future belonged to those bold enough to claim it. These ideas were spreading like fire through dry grass. On council worlds, young aliens were consuming human entertainment smuggled across borders. They watched human films and read human books translated into 100 different languages. They listened to human music and wondered why their own culture had nothing so wild and free. A student named Terra lived on the Krellin homeworld in a cramped apartment shared with 4 others. He had grown up learning that the council's word was law, that the old ways were the only ways, that questioning authority led only to chaos and destruction. Then a friend showed him a human film. It was banned, which made it irresistible. The story followed a small group of rebels fighting against a vast, powerful empire. They had no chance of winning by any sensible measure. But they refused to give up. They refused to kneel. And in the end, against all logic, they won. Tervax watched the film 3 times in one night. Something shifted in his understanding of the universe. All his life, he had been taught that the powerful always triumphed, that the weak always submitted, that this was the natural order of things. But the humans did not seem to know this. Or perhaps they knew it and simply did not care. Tervax was not alone. Across the galaxy, beings who had never met a human were beginning to ask dangerous questions. Why did the Council get to decide everything? Why had nothing changed in 6,000 years? Why were new ideas treated as threats instead of opportunities? On Earth, President Hughes received regular briefings on this quiet revolution. He understood that the conflict had moved beyond ships and weapons. Humanity was fighting a war of ideas, and ideas could not be defeated by blockades. Ambassador Morrison met with Yanara several more times over the following weeks. Each meeting brought new information, new opportunities, new glimpses of a galaxy that was more complicated than humans had ever imagined. The Council was not a unified enemy, but a collection of old alliances and older grudges, held together by tradition and mutual suspicion. Humanity did not have to defeat the Council. They only had to survive long enough for the Council to defeat itself. On a transport ship returning to Earth, Linda stood by a window and watched the stars slip past. She thought about Yanira's words, about the dangerous idea that humanity represented. It was strange to think that stories and songs might be as important as weapons. Strange but somehow right. Humanity had always been a species of dreamers. They told stories around campfires, long before they built cities. They imagined futures they could not see, and then worked to make those futures real. Now their dreams were reaching across the galaxy, touching minds that had never imagined anything beyond the Council's ancient order. The blockade still held. The threat of war still loomed. But something had changed in the darkness between the stars. Seeds had been planted that would take years to grow, and somewhere on the Krellin homeworld, a young student named Tervax was watching another human film, learning another dangerous lesson about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that their fate has already been decided. The future was coming, and it looked nothing like the past. High Chancellor Varoth stood before the full Galactic Council, his gray face hard as iron. The broadcast reached every world in known space. A display of power meant to show that the Council still controlled the galaxy's destiny. His words were cold and final. Humanity had been given every chance to obey galactic law. They had chosen defiance at every turn. They had humiliated the blockade, encouraged rebellion on Council worlds, and spread dangerous ideas among species that had been peaceful for thousands of years. The time for diplomacy had ended. The Council authorized full military action. Not the gentle pressure of a blockade, but a complete invasion of human space. The combined fleet numbered more than 2,000 warships drawn from 9 member species. Their orders were simple: force Earth to surrender, occupy all human colonies, and ensure that humanity's dangerous expansion ended forever. On Earth, the news arrived during a peaceful summer afternoon. Families sat around screens in living rooms and backyards watching the translated broadcast with growing horror. In bars and restaurants, strangers turned to look at each other, the same question visible in every pair of eyes. What do we do now? President Daniel Hughes addressed the world that evening. His speech was short, his words carefully chosen. The Council had decided that humanity's existence threatened their comfortable order. They were sending an armada to teach Earth a lesson in obedience. Humanity, he said quietly, had never been good at learning lessons from others. The military response began within hours. Admiral Catherine Price worked around the clock, coordinating with colonial defense forces, merchant ship captains who volunteered for combat duty, and civilian groups who refused to evacuate their homes. Earth's fleet was badly outnumbered and hopelessly outgunned, but they had advantages that the Council could not copy or steal. They knew the terrain. Every asteroid field, every gas giant's gravity well, every dangerous shortcut in human space had been mapped by explorers who risked their lives to reach new worlds. The Council fleet relied on ancient star charts and predictable routes. Human defenders knew paths that existed in no official record. They had something to fight for. The Council fought to preserve an order that had served them for 6,000 years. Humans fought for their children, their homes, their farms and factories and schools. They fought for the right to exist without bowing to powers that decided their fate without asking their permission. And they had each other. On the colony world of Haven's Rest, a retired teacher named Patricia Moore organized her neighbors into a network of volunteer observers. Using civilian telescopes and homemade radio equipment, they tracked enemy ship movements and relayed information to the defense fleet. It was not much, but it was something in the asteroid belt of Sigma Draconis. A miner named Kevin Walsh modified his old cargo hauler with improvised weapons. The ship was slow and ugly, barely fit for combat by military standards. But Kevin knew the asteroid field like he knew his own hands, and he joined the defense flotilla without hesitation, on a space station orbiting Jupiter's moon Europa. A young engineer named Maria Santos worked 30-hour shifts converting civilian ships for military duty. She installed weapons on freighters, reinforced hulls with whatever materials were available, and solved problems that trained engineers said were impossible. Sleep could wait. Her world was at stake. The Council fleet entered human space expecting a quick campaign against a primitive species. Instead, they found a hornet's nest. The first major battle lasted 17 minutes. A frigate captain named Leonard Hayes led a squadron of converted cargo ships against a Krellin battlecruiser 10 times their size. They could not match its firepower, so they did not try. Instead, they danced around the massive warship, drawing its fire while small shuttles delivered boarding parties to its hull. The Krellin crew had trained for ship-to-ship combat. They had protocols for every situation their commanders could imagine. But they had no protocol for enemies who refused to fight fairly, who came at them through airlocks and maintenance tunnels, who turned their own ship into a battlefield. When the battlecruiser's commander finally surrendered, Admiral Sithos demanded an explanation. The captured captain's response was broadcast across the entire sector. The humans had done something unexpected, and by the time anyone adjusted, it was already too late. This pattern repeated across dozens of engagements. Human forces could not win in straight fights, so they refused to fight straight. They attacked supply lines instead of warships. They targeted communication relays instead of weapon systems. They broadcast surrender offers in alien languages, promising fair treatment to any crew that laid down their weapons. They turned the Council's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. The alien fleet was powerful because it was coordinated. But coordination required communication, and communication required predictable patterns. Every time humans did something unexpected, the Council ships had to stop and wait for orders from commanders who had never faced anything unexpected in their long careers. Weeks became months. The Council fleet advanced but slowly, and at a terrible cost that shocked observers throughout the galaxy. Worlds that had watched the COI inflict from a safe distance began to change their opinions. Perhaps humanity was not a threat to be crushed. Perhaps they were something else entirely. On Haven's Rest, Patricia Moore received a message of thanks from Admiral Price herself. The intelligence her volunteer network had provided had saved 3 human ships from an ambush. The retired teacher who had spent her life explaining math problems to bored teenagers had helped turn the tide of a space battle in the Sigma Draconis asteroid belt. Kevin Walsh lost his converted hauler in a fight with 2 Council patrol ships. He managed to cripple both enemies before his own vessel broke apart. A rescue team found him floating in a survival pod 3 days later, dehydrated and half-frozen, but alive. His first words when they woke him up were a question about whether his asteroid claim was still valid. On the Europa station, Maria Santos received a commendation she had not requested. She barely noticed. There were still ships to modify, still problems to solve, still work to do. She celebrated by taking a 4-hour nap, the longest rest she had allowed herself in weeks. The Council fleet was not defeated. Human casualties mounted with each passing day. Colonies fell silent as communication arrays were destroyed. The war was far from over, and no one could predict how it would end. But something had changed. The invincible armada that had expected to sweep through human space in weeks was now grinding forward through a maze of traps and ambushes. Every victory cost more than planned. Every step forward revealed new problems, and across the galaxy, people were watching. Species that had never questioned the Council's authority now wondered if the ancient order was as permanent as they had been taught. If a young species like humanity could hold back the combined might of 9 older civilizations, what did that say about the nature of power? High Chancellor Voroth refused to admit the possibility of failure. But in quiet moments, when no one else could see, he studied the reports from the front and felt something he had not experienced in centuries. Doubt the humans should have been crushed by now. Every calculation said so. Every tradition confirmed it. Yet they fought on, stubborn and creative, and impossibly difficult to predict. Perhaps, Vora thought in his darkest moments, the Council had finally found something it could not control. The war continued. The future remained uncertain. But in that uncertainty, humanity found hope. They were still standing. And that meant everything was still possible. The final battle never happened. High Chancellor Voreth stood before the Galactic Council one last time, his gray skin pale with exhaustion. The great chamber fell silent as he began to speak. Every representative knew that this moment would be remembered for thousands of years. The campaign against humanity had consumed resources that would take generations to replace. Ships that had served for centuries were now debris floating in human space. Crews trained over decades were gone. 17 member species had suffered. Casualties that they could not explain to their populations. Back home, worse than the losses, was the damage to the Council's reputation. The alliance that had ruled the galaxy for 6,000 years was cracking apart. Member species questioned whether the war served any purpose beyond Krellin pride. Younger generations on dozens of worlds demanded to know why they were dying to punish a species that had done them no direct harm, and through it all, humanity refused to yield. Ambassador Linda Morrison walked into the council chamber alone. She had no guards, no weapons, no diplomatic team. She walked through corridors filled with beings who had spent the past year trying to destroy her species. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space as hundreds of alien eyes watched her. Approach, she carried only a small device containing Earth's proposal and the authority to speak for all humanity. Outside the chamber's enormous windows, a single human ship waited in orbit. Its running lights blinked slowly, a patient rhythm that somehow communicated both strength and restraint. The vessel was small compared to the Council warships that surrounded it, but it held its position without hesitation. Linda spoke for 3 hours. She talked about human history, about the wars humanity had fought against itself and the fragile peace they had built from the ruins. She described children growing up on colony worlds, looking at unfamiliar stars and dreaming of what lay beyond the horizon. She explained why humanity could not accept the Council's original terms. Not because they wanted conflict, but because surrender would mean betraying everything that made them who they were. She spoke of farmers like Sandra Ellis on New Portland, growing food in alien soil because humans could not stop reaching for new frontiers. She spoke of freighter captains like Dorothy Bennett, who ran the blockade not for glory, but because children needed medicine. She spoke of engineers and miners and teachers and soldiers, ordinary people who had done extraordinary things because their way of life was worth defending. At the end, she made humanity's offer. Earth would not demand payment for the invasion. They would not seek revenge against species that had attacked their worlds. They asked only for recognition, a place in the galactic community as equals, not servants. Partners, not subjects. The vote was not unanimous. The Krellin Dominion and their closest allies voted against, their pride wounded beyond easy healing. High Chancellor Vorath himself opposed the measure, his 4 eyes hard with anger that he could barely contain. But the Velith sovereignty voted yes. For the first time in recorded history, they publicly opposed the Krellin position. Counselor Yanara stood in her place and spoke words that echoed across the galaxy. The future cannot be stopped, only delayed. Wisdom lies in recognizing when the old ways must change. Other species followed. Some voted enthusiastically, relieved that the costly war was finally ending. Others voted with reluctant practicality, calculating that peace was less expensive than continued conflict. A few abstained, unwilling to commit either way. When the final count was announced, the chamber fell completely silent. The measure had passed. Humanity had won. The news reached Earth at midday. In cities and towns across the planet, people gathered in streets and parks, uncertain how to process what had happened. There were celebrations, of course. Fireworks lit up the sky above dozens of cities. Strangers hugged each other in the streets. The sounds of joy echoed from every continent. But there were also quiet moments. Candles lit for those who had not survived to see this day. Families gathered around photographs of loved ones lost in the fighting. The victory was real, but so was the cost. On Haven's Rest, Patricia Moore sat on the porch of her small house and watched the sunset paint unfamiliar colors across the alien sky. Her volunteer network had helped coordinate some of the final defense operations. A small contribution, perhaps, but she was proud of it. Now, she supposed, she could go back to teaching. But she suspected her lessons would be different from now on, in the Sigma Draconis asteroid belt. Kevin Walsh returned to mining after his rescue and recovery. His old hauler was gone, destroyed in battle, but he had already started saving for a new one. The modifications he had made during the war gave him ideas for improving civilian ships too. There was money to be made in that, probably. He kept a piece of his old ship's hull mounted on his wall. Just in case, he told visitors. You never knew when the galaxy might need reminding that humans did not accept ultimatums lying down. On the Europa station, Maria Santos received official recognition for her engineering work during the crisis. She accepted the award politely, then went back to her workshop. There were always more problems to solve, more systems to improve. The war might be over, but the work never stopped. On the Krellin homeworld, the student Terravox watched the Council's announcement with his study group. Beings who had grown up learning that the galaxy's order was eternal and unchangeable sat in stunned silence as the results were read. None of them spoke, but something passed between them in that moment. A question. Or perhaps the beginning of an answer. Aboard the Council flagship, High Chancellor Vorath requested a private meeting with Ambassador Morrison. They sat alone in a small room. Two individuals representing civilizations that had spent a year trying to destroy each other. Vorath asked her a question that had haunted him since the conflict began. How had humanity known they could win? Their technology was inferior. Their numbers were smaller. Their experience with interstellar conflict was measured in decades, not millennia. By every rational calculation, they should have surrendered within weeks. Linda considered her answer carefully. Humanity had not known they could win, she admitted. They had simply refused to accept that they must lose. There was a difference between those two things, though it took a certain kind of people to understand it. Vorath studied her face for a long moment. His 4 eyes showed emotions that his translator could not capture. Then, slowly, for the first time since Linda had met him, the High Chancellor of the Galactic Council did something unexpected. He smiled, perhaps. He said quietly, "The galaxy had been waiting for a species like humanity without knowing it. Perhaps change was not the enemy of order, but its necessary companion. Perhaps after 6,000 years of careful stability, the universe was ready for something new." The ambassador and the chancellor shook hands. The gesture meant nothing in Krellin culture, but Vorath had learned its significance from his studies of humanity. A promise between equals. A sign of respect. Outside the room's window, stars burned with ancient light. They had shone for billions of years before any intelligent species looked up at them. They would continue burning for billions more, indifferent to the small beings who fought and dreamed beneath their glow. But those small beings mattered too. They told stories and built homes and raised children and wondered what lay beyond the next horizon. They made mistakes and learned from them, or sometimes did not. They hurt each other and healed each other in endless cycles of conflict and reconciliation. And sometimes, when the universe demanded that they kneel, they chose to stand instead. Humanity had not yielded. The galaxy would never be the same in cities across Earth. Children who had grown up during the war looked up at the stars with new eyes. They had learned that those distant lights were not just beautiful mysteries, but places where people lived and worked and dreamed. Places that could be reached. Futures that could be claimed. The story was not over. It was only beginning, and somewhere out there, among the countless worlds of the galaxy, other beings were learning the same lesson that humanity had taught. The future belonged to those bold enough to reach for it. All they had to do was refuse to yield.